Morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Staying Ahead Amidst Growing Concerns on Increasing Cybersecurity Threats, a partner session by Singapore Corporate Counsel Association and LexisNexis. My name is Amelia and I'm from LexisNexis. Before we start, I'd just like to share a short introduction of who LexisNexis is and how we support the corporate legal professionals. So LexisNexis Legal and Professional is a leading global provider of information and analytics that enable professionals in legal, corporate, government, and non-profit organizations to improve decision-making and achieve better business outcomes. We are a part of Relax Group serving customers in more than 130 countries with 10,000 employees worldwide. Across the globe, we combine content, technology, and analytics to advance the rule of law and shape a more just world. LexisNexis offers businesses comprehensive regulatory information and practical guidance in managing a company's legal risks. Our portfolio of solutions include practical guidance, MLEX, as well as international regulatory compliance. Lexis Advanced Practical Guidance provides corporate legal with the know-how and step-by-step guidance to their daily legal matters, significantly reduce the time spent researching and preparing a matter. All modules include a range of topics and give an overview, access to a broad range of drafting notes, commentary, checklists, forms and precedents, cases and legislation. Current available modules include corporate, commercial, dispute resolution, employment, family, intellectual property and information technology, private client and tax. Earlier in June this year, we also launched a new data privacy and protection module. Just to share some examples from the topic 3 under the latest data privacy and protection module, such as the personal data protection regime in Singapore, collection, use, or disclosure or storage of personal data, as well as information on the Do Not Call register and more. Guidance content is also available in multiple jurisdictions. Other solutions include MLEX. MLEX is a specialized regulatory risk intelligence service providing exclusive market insight, analysis, and commentary globally, and also international regulatory compliance, a legal obligation register and alerting solution that combines regulatory content with technology to empower you to take control of your compliance obligations. We partner leading legal and industry experts to provide a practical, plain language interpretation of all relevant legislation and regulatory materials, so you don't have to. Available modules includes anti-bribery and corruption, anti-money laundering, cybersecurity, and data privacy across multiple regions. To find out more, you can click on the links provided, which I'll share in the Zoom chat box later. Good news for all attendees of today's webinar. You are entitled to a complimentary 7-day trial for Lexis Advanced Practical Guidance. You may scan the QR code on screen now to request for your 7 days trial. We are honored to have Jonathan, Sharon, and Alvin from Withers KhattarWong, a strategic content partner of LexisNexis today, as our panelists for the session. They are key contributors to Lexis Advanced Practical Guidance modules, such as data privacy and protection, intellectual property and information technology, employment, the King's Court Form Singapore, and a recent book on information asset protection. You can also enjoy a 15% discount on the information asset protection title via our online store by entering the promo code SCCA IAP15 upon checkout. I'll share the links via the Zoom chat box later on as well. Do keep a lookout for it. Without further ado, I'll hand the time over to the panelists. Should you have any questions throughout the session, please share them under the Q&A option. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. Thanks for having us. Just a brief intro to Withers. Withers is an international law firm with 18 offices worldwide, including in London, New York, Boston, Geneva, Milan, the BVI, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So with over 180 partners and more than 500 other lawyers, we are trusted advisors to businesses, families, entrepreneurs, investors, and technology companies with complex legal needs. In order to better serve our technology-focused clients, Withers has a global team of over 20 technology specialists serving clients in areas such as intellectual property, investment funds, tax structuring, mergers and acquisitions, commercialization of digital assets, and dispute resolution. Our team is called Withers Tech. My name is Alvin. I'm a special counsel in the IP team at Withers, and it's my pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon with my colleagues, Mr. Jonathan Kok and Ms. Sharon Lim. Jonathan leads our intellectual property and technology practice in Singapore and is also the co-leader of our Withers Tech Asia team, while Sharon is a partner in our litigation and arbitration team. I've taken a quick look at our attendance list and I see many familiar names. It's good to see some of our old friends. Please note that our webinar today is predominantly discussion-based. If along the way you have any questions, do enter them into the chat box and we will find an appropriate time to address them. We have been told to complete this webinar in 60 minutes, so in case we are not able to answer all your questions within time, please leave your email address and we will follow up by email. So moving ahead with our topic today, which is how to stay ahead of increasing cybersecurity threats. Now, this is a topic I'm sure is close to all of our hearts, as the COVID pandemic has accelerated the trend of many facets of society moving online through the broad adoption of digital technologies. So predictably, with activities such as shopping and social interactions for business moving online, inevitably so too have criminal activities. Some of the important facts and figures. In July 2021, Channels News Asia reported that cybercrime made up 43% of overall crime in 2020. Looking at timelines and the facts, in February 2020, when the World Health Organization officially named the coronavirus disease COVID-19, a secondary but significant threat to the technology-driven world followed. Between January to April 2020, Interpol detected 907,000 spam messages, 737 malware-related incidents, and 48,000 malicious URLs typed COVID-19. What does this mean? It means that cyber criminals are indiscriminately attacking computer networks and systems of individuals, businesses, and global organizations as small business activities move online. The World Economic Forum reported that the pandemic led to a 50.1% increase in cyber attacks and an associated 30,000 cyber attacks, which were specifically COVID-19 related, between 31st December 2019 and 14 April 2020 alone. So this really sounds like misery loves company. My first question to our panelists, what do you think is the reason for this incredible surge in cybercrime? Sharon, would you like to offer your views?
Okay, I would like to take a very cynical view on this. I would think that hackers these days are very good at selling their services. So it's akin to having a professional hired gun, right? And if doing competition can be tough in with social media being very intense, especially on the marketing front, I'm not surprised if competitors actually hired these hackers to hack into their competitor system to obtain information, or just as a means of sabotage. It could be as a simple reason, I just don't want my competitors to do as well, and this is just to throw them off guard.
Right.
Okay. Well, my take on this is that actually cyber attacks has been prevalent even pre-COVID. So if you talk to any CTO of any organization, they'll tell you that it's a daily occurrence, especially CTOs in financial institutions or any other organizations that provide who carry out sensitive data. So it's nothing new to them, but it's just that with COVID, the pandemic, especially the lockdown, there's been an increase in attacks simply because organizations have been forced to work remotely. Because of government directive, everyone's got to work from home, no one can come to the office. And many employees just had to scramble to find how they can connect with the organization's network. And as you can imagine, if you're working from home and you're using your home computer, using some VPN that connects in that may not be so stable because of your Wi-Fi network strength, your home Wi-Fi, Now that actually creates vulnerability points between the computer and the network, because the transmission may be unencrypted and it may be exposed to cyber attacks. There's this thing called man-in-the-middle attacks. Okay, that's where cyber attackers or hackers try to intercept you while you're transmitting data between your computer and your company or your organization's network. So when you have employees working remotely, whether from home or some of them decide, okay, I'm gonna take the opportunity to sit in a cafe and use a public network, public Wi-Fi. Now then, you can imagine that exposes your systems to cyber attacks, and that's where I think the danger has arisen. Alvin mentioned about the Channel News Asia report. Actually, that was a report on the findings of the Cybersecurity Agency, where they did a Singapore cybersecurity report, and they actually noted that there's been a rise in ransomware, malware, but phishing, which used to be very popular, actually dropped by about 1%, whereas ransomware increased by 154% over the last year. So that's quite significant, where you see that cyber criminals are changing tactic simply because the technology environment has changed as well, and they're seizing whatever opportunities that they can to infiltrate organizations' network and systems.
Thanks very much, John. Well, we heard you mention the two terms, phishing and malware. Maybe we start with phishing. What does the term phishing mean, and how can we protect our organizations against it?
Okay, so what is phishing? I think I believe most would have experienced phishing before. If you don't know that it was phishing, you may receive a notice. I get a lot from PayPal telling me that my credit card has expired or that my account details need to be updated. But when I look at this, I mean, the email looks very authentic. It's got all the features of PayPal, the logo, the layout and everything. Even the notices, the privacy notices at the bottom, all seems to replicate a genuine, authentic PayPal notice. But when you look at the name of the sender, it's some garbled email address, obviously not from PayPal. So some telltale signs are, look at who the sender is, the email address, and then if they write to you very anonymously, like, "Hi, we noticed that your account is most organizations wouldn't do that." Okay, but what is the purpose of a phishing email? So they send you all these emails and they ask you to click and enter to go and update your identification, your password or your account number, and so on and so forth. They ask you to verify it. But once you click that link, what happens is that the cyber attackers actually downloads a malware into your system, okay, and that's where it sits in your system, and it can lie there dormant for many years, and that's what happened to the Singapore Institute of Health, that SingHealth case, where 1.5 million health records from SGH were hacked. The malware actually sat in the system for months or even years, lying dormant, and they'll strike at the appropriate time. So what phishing does is they send you a somewhat innocuous looking email pretending to be some other agency. Your staff clicks on it, malware is loaded onto your system. It sits there until an appropriate time to then attack and lock up all your data. Okay, now, so how do you prevent that? Actually, there's really no way of preventing it other than educating your staff not to open suspicious email. Okay, so in our organization, in our firm, I see, we've told our staff and reminded them time again, don't open suspicious email. And we do send emails with attachments and with links to our IT department to scan to make sure that it's legitimate. And if they clear it, then we will click the links or open the attachment. So this is something that you really have to educate your staff, because no one's going to be sitting at your staff's computer and tell them, hey, that's a phishing email. They've got to know it themselves, and they've got to look out for telltale signs. So as I mentioned earlier, phishing was really the main way of infiltrating organizations' network. But as the CSA reported, it has dropped. Ransomware, malware, because of other means of infiltrating the system, has risen instead over the past year.
Thanks, John. You also mentioned ransomware. Sharon, you've done some ransomware cases. Now, could you share what is ransomware and the threat that it poses?
Okay, I mean, ransomware, as its names imply, is actually a software, a malicious software that is designed to block an employee's access to, or a person's access to the computer system and encrypt the data. So in demand for ransom to be paid, and only upon payment, then the decryption process will happen. So usually, if payment is not made, hackers, I mean the threat actors always threaten to put all this information online, especially if they are sensitive information relating to the trade. They will always use that as a basis to demand for ransom. And one might ask, what is the purpose of putting it online? Wouldn't it then be, like open to the public? What does the hackers, what do the hackers gain out of this disclosure? So it has been suggested to me before that because these companies that are targeted are usually large companies, so they have shares. So when such information are released in the market that, oh, your system has been compromised, your system has been hacked, the share price dropped, and that's where the hackers actually take advantage of the fluctuation in the share price to make a gain out of it. So there is a gain, even if they do release such information or news about your system being compromised, they actually do gain from the sale of the share price. Of course, I mean, their ultimate aim is to get the ransom from you. And the trend these days has been to demand for cryptocurrencies payment, and this is one case that we did recently where the demand was in bitcoins, and we actually had to advise our clients to engage a specialist negotiator to make sure that we work in tandem with them, and hopefully we can recover the bitcoin after making payment. It is not a case where when a demand is made, you make payment immediately. So that is actually the wrong approach, and CSA would discourage that as well. So that's why it's important to know what to do when you are faced with a ransomware situation.
Thanks, Sharon. So Sharon, in general, what is your advice to organizations affected by ransomware? Should they pay the ransom upon demand or not?
Yeah, I mean, like what I mentioned earlier, the Singapore government actually discouraged that because they do not just want you to make payment and then be a subject matter of another attack again. So it actually encourages the hackers to be more bold in their attempts after they succeed once. So it has to be a very holistic approach. When you are faced with a ransomware attack, I think the first point is to make sure that to see where is the source of attack and to narrow it down to that breach so that it doesn't spread further. And also even if you have, I mean, if you're lucky, you purchase cybersecurity insurance, and that's where you need to engage your lawyers and insurers to take a holistic approach in approaching this, so that when you are making payments, it is done with a certain steps, with a certain recourse that is anticipated in future. So while there's no prohibition against making payment in Singapore, I mean, other issues that we often warn our clients to watch out for is you may be financing terrorism. So there's this financing of terrorism. So there's this Terrorism Act that prevents you from financing a terrorist. There's also this anti-money laundering act that related laws to prevent one from financing such like drug organization or serious crimes division. So I think that is something that you have to be concerned about when making payment, and this would only come in when you have already sought legal advice, and you have already got the insurers on board, and they are professionals dealing with the situation when you're faced with a ransomware attack.
Thanks, Sharon. I'll chip in a little bit here, as one of my own personal clients last year also encountered a ransomware attack. Now, this ransomware attack was aimed at its critical software systems. No personal data was involved, but thankfully my client had backed up the critical software and the intellectual property needed to operate its business. So I guess the moral of the story here is to be really proactive, because it's really too late if you didn't do your backup, to be dealing with a threat of having your business shut down or paying the ransom. Apart from that, I think legal teams do need to consult with their IT teams and cybersecurity professionals to install technical safeguards. Apart from backup, it's important not to give all employees the software installation or admin privileges. And of course, it's vital to install antivirus software to detect all the malware as they arrive, and whitelisting software to actually stop them from executing. Moving on to the next trend, I think that we have been seeing quite a lot in news is companies moving towards transitioning data storage and other services to cloud. We have seen several of the foremost companies in the world, such as Alibaba, Huawei, Amazon Web Services, all offering a one-stop store for all enterprise applications, including website building, SMS and email services, business security, and data storage. John, this is one of your areas of expertise. What is the practical consequence, you think, of companies adopting cloud storage, and what impact does this have on their cybersecurity challenges and risks?
Okay. Okay. First of all, cloud services is something that's picking up phenomenally in this past few years, but more so in the last year because of this remote working. If you're from a traditional organization where everything is housed on premises, your servers, your network, everything, and you're using proprietary system, you find that if your staff have to work remotely, the proprietary system may not be so efficient in supporting a remote working. And whereas if you are using cloud-based systems, actually cloud-based facilitates use of the platform or the service usually through a web portal or browser. So that makes things a lot easier and accessible from wherever. So because of COVID pandemic, most organizations have had to scramble and look for cloud-based services to deploy. Now, so what is cloud-based services? It just means that there's a service provider that provides a software application or even a platform that allows organizations to use their system. And this can be used by many different subscribers at the same time. So there's somewhat economies of scale. So you don't have to worry as an organization, as a subscriber, end user, you don't have to worry about maintaining the system, upgrading the system, keeping it most up to date, and installing patches and all that. That's all done by the cloud service provider. All you require basically is the rights to access the services that they provide. But there are different levels or different types of cloud services. Some are called software as a service, some are platform as a service, and others are like infrastructure as a service. So as you can imagine, the scale of services provided kind of rises with each level. If you're talking about software as a service, it tends to be just a particular functionality or service that is being provided to end users. So some of the common ones would be like payroll system, HR systems, and so on. You'll find that these are very specific, okay? Whereas a very specific module or service that's being provided by the cloud service provider. Whereas in relation to a platform, the service provider actually just gives you the platform, and you're allowed to load on whatever types of different modules or services that you require for your organization. All right. In any organization, you can actually have a combination. Some aspects of your organizational work could be software as a service. Other areas like your supply chain or your organizational management could be loaded on uploaded onto a platform. All right. So there are different modules, and it doesn't mean that you only need to use one. You can use, as an organization, you can use various services depending on your organizational needs. All right. So they tend to be large organizations, as we mentioned. There's Amazon Web Services, there's software, Microsoft, and a few others that provide such services that you can sign up for. Okay.
Thanks, Jonathan. I noticed there's a very good question coming in, so maybe we'll take a step backwards. The question is, payment of ransomware is not encouraged by authorities, but is it prohibited by law? And then cybersecurity insurance policy comes with a clause that ransomware is covered except prohibited by law. So what are the relevant laws in Singapore with respect to ransomware? And I think Sharon Sharon, would you like to comment?
Yes, like I mentioned earlier, there is no prohibition against payment. It's just that when you are making payment, you must take into considerations other laws relating to payment. So like financing terrorism and financing, and any other anti-money laundering rules relating to like corruption, drug trafficking, and serious crimes. So these are the ancillary laws that you have to take into consideration when you are making payment. It is not prohibited by law. The payment itself is not prohibited. It is discouraged because they do not want a victim to be a victim again, and encouraging the hackers to be more bold in their attempts. That is the main reason why the policy states that not to make payments. But I mean, maybe at this juncture, I'd like to share the recent US case where Colonial was being targeted, and Colonial is basically a gas supplier, and they were being held at ransom in relation to their pipelines, and their data were being compromised. So the amount that was demanded was about $5 million. So they had to pay in cryptocurrency. But the payment was made in tandem and in conjunction with consultations with FBI and their lawyers. So they make sure that the payment went through in such a way that it doesn't offend any existing regulations. So it is not just about making payment, it's about making payment with the view to make sure that your act does not infringe any other laws. And also, I mean, to sidetrack a little bit, because subsequently they were also sued by their suppliers due to the gas shortage in US as a result of the infiltration by the hackers. They had to stop the system, and there was some gas station that couldn't get the supplies. About 45% of the gas was supplied by this company. So it was actually a major disruption, price hike, and there was gas shortage. So due to the business interruption, they also face other claims by the gas that suppliers that they supplied to for the business interruption. So that's the reason why it's important to involve the right people at the beginning, even before you make payment. While the data is very important to the company because they couldn't function and they were literally paralyzed due to the encryption. But after they have consulted their lawyers, they at least take a very holistic approach in managing the situation and to make sure that their damage is minimized. I think their system was actually stopped for about a week, so it was really a major disruption in the US, and it made the headlines. So that's one consideration in terms of the law and in terms of payment.
Thanks very much for clearing that up, Sharon. I think it's very clear. I think in Singapore, in August, we also had a case from the Iclinic. Can you remind us, was there payment or not?
For the Iclinic case, there was no payment. In fact, they managed it very well because they had a cloud-based system, like what Jonathan mentioned. They had a cloud-based system to manage their clients' medical records. So they were not paralyzed. They were able to function. So the only data that was encrypted was like names, addresses, and telephone numbers of the clients and customers who attended at the clinic. But in terms of their medical records, they stored it in a cloud system. So in that sense, they were safe because they actually took steps to preempt possible hacking, and this actually helped them to manage the situation better. And no ransom was paid.
Thanks very much, Sharon. So I'm sorry, John, for jumping backwards, but I did have a question after a very good presentation on the different service models. I think our in-house counsel colleagues may be interested to sometimes understand, since there are different types of cloud service models like IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. Is there any general advice you would give on what service model their organizations might want to adopt?
Okay. Okay, that's actually an operational issue as to which one works well for you. But with with organizations that have built into their system some due diligence process in selecting vendors, it's advisable always to do a check on your proposed cloud service provider as to how secure is their system, how reliable are they, and so on. Don't always just go for the cheapest, because there's always issues about technical support. Where are their servers? There's this thing about data sovereignty. If you store data in certain countries, then the authorities there may have access to your data. So there's always concern about where are the cloud service providers' data centers and where your data will be housed. So that also leads to the question, when you enter into the service agreement or contracts with them, question then is, what are the terms that you need to look out for? So definitely service level maintenance to make sure that it's a reliable system. The last thing you want is to sign up with a vendor whose system is not stable and always crashes. I mean, that's not new. Even for us, we do have experiences with that. Some database management systems that sometimes not so stable and can't access all the data when you want it to. So service level maintenance, confidentiality of your data, what security measures that they will put into place in their systems, and then indemnity should there be a breach or should there be failure in their system. If it doesn't mean that just because they are a cloud service provider, they are not vulnerable to cyber attacks. They too are vulnerable. So you must also make sure whether they have a backup system or you yourself make sure that your data is backed up somewhere, so that even if their system, your cloud service provider system is hacked, and it may affect your access to the system, but you have backed up your data, so you can always either run a backup system or quickly jump onto another system to access your data. So some of these backup plans needs to be worked into your decision as to who you should use in engaging a cloud service provider. But with organizations we work with, it's not, they would have a data management team or data protection management team that will assess these kind of decisions, and to make sure that there's a checklist for the different business units to go through when selecting vendors or when putting up their tender proposal and so on. So you have to build in all these into your system, and not just as though you're buying something off the shelf. It is not. It has to be tailored to your operational requirements, and make sure that you have done your due diligence in relation to the reliability and the security of the cloud service provider that you want to engage. So these are just some pointers that you need to just bear in mind when you go through this process. Yeah.
Thanks, John. How important is it in your view that the outsourcing agreements with these cloud service providers to spell out the cybersecurity responsibilities of the contracting parties? And is it possible for organizations to hive off their responsibilities under their legal responsibilities?
Okay. The contract, of course, if they try to absolve themselves from liability and all that, then obviously it's not acceptable. They should take responsibility for their own failures in the system, and the indemnification clause should provide for that. But beyond that, there's also the statutory obligations under the Personal Data Protection Act, the PDPA, where even though the data controller, that's to say your organization, is primarily responsible for all data that you collect, and even if you outsource them to third parties, like a cloud service provider, you as the organization that initially collected the personal data are still responsible for any breach of the obligations under the PDPA. So the Commission will still go after you if there should be a breach, whether it's caused by your own organization or by a third-party vendor, what we call a data intermediary, which you have engaged. And in this case, we're talking about a cloud service provider. But over and above that, the PDPA also places the protection obligation on data intermediaries. Data intermediaries are not subject to the 10 different obligations under the PDPA. They are only obliged to observe a few, particularly the protection obligation, the retention obligation. So protection obligation, if you have been following the enforcement decisions of PDPC, you'll find that most actions against an organization is for failure to uphold the protection obligation. In other words, they did not have a secure system that protected the data, and which resulted in a data leak or a hack into the system, and the data being extracted by hackers. So in the same way, your cloud service provider, your data intermediary, are also obliged to ensure that their systems are equally safe. So if there should be a breach or hack into their system and the data that they store is compromised, then they are also liable under the PDPA and would be subject to an investigation by the Commission.
Thanks, John. This is really clear. Moving on to data breaches. We know from statistics that we see that the average cost of data breaches has been soaring. Per incident during the pandemic, we are looking at 20 to 30,000 or more. 5% of the successful attacks can cost businesses 1 million or more. 85% of successful data breaches involve defrauding humans. 61% of data breaches result from schemes to swipe login credentials, such as phishing. Now, we also know that the laws governing the maximum financial penalty for PDPA breaches have recently increased to 1 million, or 10% of an organization's annual turnover in Singapore, if the turnover exceeds 10 million, whichever is higher. I think those organizations who have who handle personal data from EU nationals will also know that the GDPR, under GDPR, the EU data protection authorities can impose fines of up to 20 million euros. So what is clear is that there is a huge cost when there is a breach. So, or when after a commission has done its investigation, an organization is adjudged to have not met its obligations under the Act. So I'd like to discuss, moving on, what is it organizations must do in order to ensure that they meet their obligations to make reasonable security arrangements to prevent unauthorized access to the data that they are holding. So very, very briefly, it's very important to install the appropriate security systems to provide early warnings of potential breaches. there needs to be a lot of homework done to determine which security system is appropriate, right? Because that basically entails an organization doing an audit of where is the data held, is it in private servers, cloud servers, physically stored, and to come up with data and a document inventory. And then on top of that, after putting those information together, organizations need to identify the critical business processes and the assets that those processes handle. So any of these data, for any of this data that is critical and important and subject to regulatory requirements, those IT processes for documenting and reporting a breach needs to be done. So now I also want to talk a little bit about policies and practices, because in some of the cases where the companies that have been investigated have actually fallen short of even what we call the Section 12 PDPA obligation, which is a very basic thing in having developing their policies and practices that are necessary to meet their obligations under the Act. So in short, what really this means is that, does your organization have an anti-phishing policy? Do you have the IT policies for ensuring, for example, that your antivirus software has been installed, is up to date, and everybody has them? So things like this, a checklist needs to be done. And then moving forward now, what happens if, touch wood, a breach is discovered? Now, obviously, the first step is companies need to develop a data breach management plan well in advance. Why is this? Because there are reporting and assessment requirements, obligations that are mandatory under the Act. And the reporting requirements are that you have to report in 3 days. So if this plan is not done in advance, it's almost impossible practically to do your assessment within time. Secondly, organizations must respond very swiftly to identify, contain, and then mitigate the breaches to ensure that they meet the obligations under the law. So just going down the checklist, just bear with me. Some of these things you may already know, but when a breach is discovered, practically it's quite important to first verify the source of breach notification. Now, is it genuine? Remember, don't click on emails, because you have to beware of the phishing threat, right? If there is a official website from the person contacting you on this breach, always contact the company via the official email or the contact that's listed. Containment-wise, if there's any passwords that need to be changed, do it very quickly. Most importantly, you need to bring in or stand by an independent IT professional that specializes in incident response and gap analysis. Practically, this is important because the breach happened on your current IT provider's watch, right? So you want an independent view of what happened. And you need a very clear view, of what kind of data was compromised, who have been affected, customers, what systems are affected, what servers were affected, what databases, platforms, or services have been affected. And concurrently, after assessing the root cause, containment actions must be taken very, very quickly to minimize harm. You can imagine if the affected data relates to financial information, credit card passwords, customers need to be informed so that they can take the necessary actions to prevent further harm, right? And then within the organization, the cause of the breaches, needs to be isolated. Meaning, if you need to shut off the network to prevent further spreading of the malware, it has to be done. Now, on the duty to notify the occurrence of data breach. Now, the law requires the PDPC to be notified within 3 days if after assessment, the risk is such that you will affect, more than 500 people, or it will cause a lot of damage to persons, right? So if after assessment there is a clear assessment that this breach is notifiable, it has to be done in 3 days. Now, John, so I'd just like to ask you, do you have any concluding remarks, on, I think because I see that we're running close to time, we need to save some time for Q&A. Do you have any concluding remarks on how our in-house counsels can help their organizations stay ahead of cybersecurity threats on a daily basis?
Okay, I'll just, first of all, I want to say that, if you the PDPA requires every organization to appoint a DPO. So I presume all your organizations have already appointed a DPO. But that doesn't mean that, hey, you have done all that you need to ensure that your company or your organization is on top of things in relation to cybersecurity. We always recommend that you have a data protection management team to monitor this. And I'll say that this is not the sole responsibility of General Counsel, but it should be led by someone who is familiar with the operations of the organization and where data, how data flows within the organization. Where is it collected? Where is it distributed? How is it processed and stored and so on? So the team should make up of representatives from different departments in the organization that handles and manages data. So it could be representatives from HR, admin, ops, and then you need to have the people from legal and compliance to sit in, as well as the IT guys, to make sure that there's always this ongoing discussion as to how data is collected, where is it stored, is it safe, and then when should it be destroyed, or so that you do not retain more personal data than you require or than that is necessary for the purposes of your organization. So that's one of the retention obligation under the PDPA. So do make sure that there is such a team that has been organized within your company that will look into these issues, and then conduct periodic or training to the staff, or send out important reminders to the staff as to cyber hygiene, cyber awareness, and so on, so that as we know, the weakest link within any organization is really a staff who is not vigilant enough, and if caught by a phishing email, then that's in a malware into the system. So that's where the weakest link could be. Your IT guys being employed, their role is really to make sure that the system is working properly, up to date, all patches and bugs are fixed. That's their daily role and responsibility. Okay, but there's only so much they can do if the staff do not play along, and that's where the education, the training, the reminders needs to go out to the rest of the organization. So that's the way that's the only way you can stay ahead, to keep up to date, to keep everybody on their toes. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there will always be cyber attacks, but the question is, how prepared are you for it? Not just on a daily operational basis, but in the event of a breach, unfortunate event, what are the steps that you need to take? So some organizations even have drills as to what to do in the event of a breach. So Alvin has actually shared just now what are the data breach reporting obligations under the PDPA. Then that's something that the team has to go through, so that in the event of a breach, it's already at the back of the hand what they have to execute to mitigate the breach, and then to report, if it's a reportable breach, when to report such a breach to the PDPC. So these things have to be implemented and put in place so that you are in a good position to deal with cybersecurity risk and threats that you may face. So that's what we'll recommend to you to look into.
Just one more point to add on to Jonathan's closing remarks. I mean, based on the case that I shared earlier on Colonial Pipeline, the access was actually through a legacy VPN. So I think that's one aspect that is often missed out, is to remove any legacy user IDs, old passwords that have not been used, especially when employees leave the organization. This data might still be festering in the system and not deactivated. So that's one aspect that I think as in-house counsel may want to alert your IT guys to look into this, to make sure that any old systems or old passwords are removed, so that it will not be a means for the hackers to enter the system, because that was exactly what happened for the US case, and it was actually an unused system that allowed the hackers to infiltrate, and through that system they managed to access other data in the system. So that's just one point that I want to add on.
Okay, I see that there's a question from Jonathan Tay about who's liable in the event that data stored in the cloud service provider is breached due to some fault of the cloud service provider. Is it the data controller or data intermediary? Actually, both will be liable. The commission will investigate both parties. As I mentioned, as the data controller, you collect the data, so you have responsibility over that data. Okay, so if there should be a breach, whether by yourself or by a third-party service provider, the data intermediary, the data controller is still liable under the PDPA, and so will be investigated by the commission. Now, the reason why the data intermediary will also be investigated is because the PDPA does have provision on the responsibilities and obligations of a data intermediary. Just because you process somebody else's personal data doesn't mean that as a cloud service provider, you're not liable for the security and protection of the data that is stored on your system. So the PDPA imposes that obligation and that liability onto the data intermediary. Then we have another question: what precautions, whether it's contractual or otherwise, can we take if we store customer data on external cloud systems? So that's where we advised earlier that you do need to go and do your due diligence on the cloud service provider. Are they reputable? What kind of system have they adopted? How regularly do they update? You need to ask the right questions to assure yourself that this is a reliable cloud service provider that you want to store your customer data and personal data on their systems. Okay, this actually just reminds me of another point. We've heard stories from clients where they want to transfer data from a cloud service provider which they have terminated and export it to a new service provider. And sometimes these cloud service provider make it very difficult to export data from their system into the new service provider system. So that's another issue that you need to look into. How cooperative are they? You have to talk through with them. Of course, the contract can have a handing and taking over clause, which talks about in the event of termination, let's say 3 months before the effective date of termination, the service provider will cooperate with the end user, the subscriber, to transfer data to their new service provider, and so on and so forth. You cannot have all the contractual terms in there, but at the end of the day, it's whether they're going to be cooperative, because they know that, hey, their services are going to be terminated. They may drag their feet. So you need to have that conversation with them at the start of the engagement and hold them to their word, to hear from them how do they actually process export of data from their system to another party's system. Okay.
Yeah, just to add on to what John has said, I think for the question on what happens if I have really made it very clear what are my responsibilities and what is the cloud service provider's responsibility. It is quite important that in whatever arrangement that all the responsibilities of parties in relation to which is it the security of the cloud, security in the cloud, what components exactly, the applications, operating system, the service provider is responsible for, and what is the primary client's responsibility. All of that needs to be spelled out, and it, while everyone has the responsibility and needs to be vigilant, it's good to spell that out in case you need to make an argument that you've done what you've done your best, and the negligence, if any, falls on somebody else. Because there is actually, I think, possibility that if any third parties suffer real losses, that they actually have a cause of action for negligence, and you don't want to be the one that is caught with that that problem.
There's a question from Prasad about any difference between cloud data controller and data processor. Data processor is really, in Singapore, we call them data intermediary. They are the ones who collect data and provide data processing services for the data controller. So they are just, in the PDPA, they are generally referred to as the data intermediary. Okay, so these are the two key players in the PDPA. Okay, so terminology may change, but essentially, these are you're either a data controller or you're a data intermediary that provides services to the data controller in processing their data for them. Okay.
Thanks very much for your questions. I think we are down to our last minute. If there's any more questions, please do type them in. Okay, I think we have. Do we have any more questions? I think we do have. We do. Okay, let's check. We have answered all the questions that have been posed. So it just leaves me to thank our organizer and my colleagues, Jonathan and Sharon, of course, for all of you for asking very, very, very interesting questions that are relevant for all of us.
Well, thanks for having us on this webinar.
Thank
well,
you.
do feel free to reach out to us if you have any other issues that you face on a day-to-day basis. We are more than happy to provide you with some pointers. Thanks.